Good morning and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today, an orientation on the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund application pack. As I mentioned before, if you would like to listen to the webinar today in French, please check the bottom of your screen for the interpretation button. And there, if you click French, you should be able to hear the presentation in French. Let me also inform you that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you afterwards in case you would like to listen again. And we will also share this recording with stakeholders who are not able to join us live today. Okay, I hope you've found the right channel using the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. Now let's make a start. My name is James Wicken. I am the Head of Global Policy Advocacy and Innovation at WSSCC, which, as you know, is evolving into the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. With me today as co-presenter is Sarah Churchill. Sarah, could I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Sarah Churchill. Delighted to be here. I'm a consultant working with the fund. I work at an organization, a small nonprofit, Bridges to Development, based here in Geneva. Over.
Thank you, Sarah. And now, before we move into the presentation, let me draw your attention to the chat box on the right of the screen. If you have any questions on the content of what is presented today, please write these in the chat box. We will take a note of all of the questions and add them to a frequently asked question document that's being prepared. And we will share these frequently asked questions with everyone on the webinar so that you can see all the questions and all the answers. This is a good way to build up understanding of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operational model. So please do make good use of the chat during the call today. Next slide, please. Could go back one slide, please. Thank you. So today's webinar is part 2 of the webinar series. Some of you may have joined for the first webinar held last Tuesday, when we focused on the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy and 4 key policies. A reminder that the SHF strategy document and the policies are available on the SHF website at shfund.org. If you missed part 1 and would like to listen, we have posted a recording on YouTube, and you can get the link from your regional manager, and the link will also be included in this presentation, which we will circulate after the webinar. So, as you know, today's session will focus on the application pack, and today we'll be making a presentation on this. And as you see on your screens, the final webinar is scheduled for 2 weeks today, for the 18th of August, at exactly the same time of day. And part 3 will be a question and answer session. And we will answer questions that you have posed either through the chat box or questions that you have sent in through the regional managers. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of the presentation we will make on today's webinar. I will start with a recap of the part 1 webinar from last week and reintroduce the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operating model and talk about how this will work in this transition or startup period. After that, we will look in detail at the 3 elements of the application pack. This pack is made up of Programmatic Guidelines, Application Guidelines, and the application template. Finally, we will present the independent review process, which explains what happens after a country submits its application. Next slide, please. So here is the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operating model. This may be familiar to those of you who have now started to explore some of these documents on the shfund.org website. Starting from the left of the screen, in part 1 of this webinar series, we talked about the eligibility and transition policy and the allocation and prioritization policy. You can see those 2 steps on the left of the screen. These policies determine which countries are eligible to receive funding and the size of their allocation. The first blue block you see is national plans. The SHF funding model is designed around investing in these costed national plans or supporting their further development and refinement where necessary. Now, in different countries, you may use different terms. You may call these plans, roadmaps, action plans. And of course, there may be more than one plan. A country may have a plan for rural sanitation and hygiene, a roadmap for washing healthcare facilities, and another plan for menstrual health and hygiene, for example. These plans are there to operationalize a country's commitment to its national targets and lie at the center of SHF investments. Based on and closely aligned to these national plans, countries will make an application to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. And the second purple block is the country application step that we will be discussing today. And this is followed in the round circle by the independent review step, also covered today. Following a recommendation for approval to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund governing body by the independent review team, we move into the grant making step. Key processes here include capacity assessments of nominated primary recipients and negotiations on co-financing. Those of you who joined the last webinar will have heard about the co-financing policy, also available on the website. We then move into a cycle of performance-based disbursements, implementation, and monitoring of grant performance. At the end of the cycle, on the right-hand side of your screens, you will see transition planning. And this refers to the time when countries begin to transition away from Sanitation and Hygiene Fund support, as covered in the eligibility and transition policy discussed in part 1 of the webinar series. Along the top of your screen, you will see fragility considerations. These are covered in the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund fragility policy, also introduced in the last webinar. And this policy covers a range of provisions for amending this operating model to cater to the specific contexts of countries determined as fragile. And finally, the dotted line at the bottom refers to a subsequent allocation period, where eligible countries would again be invited to submit a new application against a new allocation. So here you have a brief overview of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operating model. Next slide, please. So, on the last slide, I described the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operating model. And you will have noticed there are some differences in this model from how the Global Sanitation Fund has operated under WSSCC. The next few years are a transition period where we move from the previous operating model to this new one, starting now in 2020. On the screen here, you see the projected timelines for this transition period. Starting on the left-hand side, a subset of eligible countries will be invited to make an application in 2020. These are the 11 countries currently receiving Global Sanitation Fund grants. The countries will receive modest allocations as the resource mobilization effort for the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund is just beginning. The intention is for this application process to be concluded at the end of 2020, with new grants signed in from the start of 2021, followed with implementation for a 2-year period. During this period, there will be a focus on learning and refining the operating model. Moving on to the dark color bars on the screen. Towards the middle of 2021, we project the first full allocation period for the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund to begin. By this stage, SHF will have secured substantial pledges and a call for applications will be opened to eligible countries. Next slide, please. Now, let's zoom in with more detail on the application process followed in each allocation period. Looking at the figure on your screen, in step 1, you see that eligible countries will receive an allocation letter communicating a country-specific allocation. This is the upper ceiling of the funding available for that country to apply for. Around the same time, in step 2, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund will issue a call for applications and publish an application pack. That is what we will look at in detail today. In step 3, countries prepare their applications based around the delivery of national plans, as mentioned previously. In step 4, there is an independent assessment of the technical soundness and feasibility of their application. Then steps 5 and 6 are grant making and signing in of the new grants. Next slide, please. Now, let's zoom in even further and take a close look at the application pack itself. As you can see on your screens, this pack comprises Programmatic Guidelines, Application Guidelines, and the application template. This is in the red box on the left of your screen and is the focus of the remainder of the webinar today. The Programmatic Guidelines explain what the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund will and will not fund, elaborate on recommended technical parameters, and provide links to other references, all of which are to be used as a guide by countries in developing their applications. The application template is the form that countries fill in and submit along with supporting materials. And the application guidelines describe the application process and give instructions and other useful information on how to develop an application and fill in the template. Looking further to the right of the screen, in the future, these programmatic guidelines will be supplemented by more information notes and technical resources, providing detailed guidance on core themes central to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. Next slide, please. In these next two slides, I will introduce the programmatic guidelines and hand over to Sarah, who will present the application guidelines and template. When you see these programmatic guidelines later this month, the first thing you will notice on the front is a note on the transition period. As I mentioned before, this is a period has a focus on learning how to optimize this model, and this includes the programmatic guidelines. We welcome feedback from technical partners and other stakeholders in country on how to strengthen these guidelines. We will organize a structured process to gather this input so that this is taken on board when we issue the next version of programmatic guidance for the first full funding round of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. You will also notice a number of transition notes. These refer to specific to applications made in 2020 during this transition period. The programmatic guidelines are organized into three main sections as follows. The first section sets the scene with reference to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategic framework covered in part 1 of this webinar series, and also a set of programming principles. This section explains how costed national plans are central to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, as mentioned earlier. This section also elaborates on the Leave No One Behind focus of the fund, including how to identify and target key populations and vulnerable groups and address gender empowerment. Section 2 is framed around the 4 strategic objectives of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund and describes what the SHF will and will not fund, and gives details on the type of actions that will be encouraged in applications. This section is aligned to the latest normative guidance for sanitation, hygiene, and menstrual health and hygiene. And you'll see that the World Health Organization guidelines on sanitation and health are most prominent. Section 3 is framed around the SHF strategic enablers and explains these cross-cutting ways of working that enable and reinforce action under the strategic objectives. Next slide, please. So on the left of the screen, you see again the 4 strategic objectives, and the strategic enablers are written in the box along the bottom of the screen. On the right-hand side, you see some of the content you can expect in the programmatic guidelines. if I pick out just a few from the list here, on the topic of infrastructure, you will find information on when this will and will not be approved in an application. You will also find details on the type of private sector engagement the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund encourages. And you'll find plenty of information on how the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund aims to align with and reinforce other elements of the sector architecture, including links with sanitation and water for all. Okay, now in a moment, I will hand over to Sarah to introduce the application guidelines and template. Before I do that, a reminder to please post any questions you have on today's presentation in the chat box, and these will be answered later in the frequently asked question document. With that, please could we go to the next slide, and I'll hand the mic to Sarah.
Thank you, James. I will now run through more detail about the application guidelines in terms of what you'll find there as a complement to those programmatic guidelines and how these can be best used to support country processes around the application development. I will also run through the application template so that you see the logic behind the line of questions posed there. So while the programmatic guidelines provide information around the technical aspects of the application to help you describe priority areas of investment that align with the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy, the application guidelines describe the process of application development, submission, and review. They also provide instructions for completing the template. The outline of the document is here on the slide. Section 1 does much of what you just heard James describe in terms of setting the scene and providing a background to the new strategic framework and operating model. Section 2 walks the reader through the many steps that can happen before you focus on the actual application. So much of what is needed to frame the request builds off of existing country information and processes, such as national strategic planning and assessment studies. And this early planning helps pave the way for an efficient application process. So this section describes those steps countries can take to prepare early on. However, we also recognize that with this transition period, countries will not be receiving the material much ahead of time, timelines are condensed, and thus preparation will be limited. Section 3 presents the application template and explains a bit about the submission process. Section 4 focuses on the independent review step that we'll touch on briefly in a minute. And similar to the programmatic guidelines, throughout the narrative of the document, we've also highlighted in blue some particular considerations around the special nature of the transition period that James explained to you earlier. In addition, and at the bottom of this slide, you see there are 6 annexes with additional details, including a list definitions of new terminology for the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, as some terminology has changed from the Global Sanitation Fund. You'll also find a list of reference documents, information about the independent review criteria, and the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund capacity assessment, a process to review the capacity of the nominated implementer or primary recipient ahead of grant approval. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we highlight information that is provided in one of those annexes, Annex 3. We wanted to highlight this one as it is a central piece to the application process. That is the role played by a multisectoral coordination mechanism in the development of the funding application. A core pillar to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund is multi-stakeholder coordination and the strengthening of partnerships across the sector and beyond. As such, the application must be derived from an inclusive and consultative dialogue across a diverse set of country stakeholders from the WASH sector and beyond. What does that really mean? Well, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund requires that the application be developed and submitted on behalf of the country through a national level body, which brings together key stakeholders from government, civil society, representatives of vulnerable populations, non-governmental organizations, development partners, the private sector, all of these key players relevant to the 4 strategic objectives of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. This national body will be referred to, for the sake of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, as the Multisectoral Coordination Mechanism, or MCM. And on the left of the slide, we summarize the key functions it will perform during the application development phase, including convening and coordinating partners to describe and prioritize interventions selected for SHF support, ensuring broad consultation efforts take place so that the application is truly reflective of inputs from diverse partners and perspectives. And they will also be responsible for ensuring the government signs off on the application ahead of submission. That means 2 signatures, including one from the Ministry of Finance. The MCM will also oversee the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund grant implementation once it is approved. Important to note, the applicant will be asked to submit the meeting minutes that describe this consultative process of application development, as well as clear documentation of the process leading to the selection of the primary recipient. Rather than create something new, countries are strongly encouraged to leverage existing mechanisms to fulfill this role. This may be, for example, the program coordinating mechanism used before under the Global Sanitation Fund. And on the right side of the slide, we list the 3 essential points to consider when composing or strengthening this mechanism to ensure that it meets the standards expected as a truly functional and representative multisectoral body. Importantly, that leadership comes from the country, the relevant government ministry, that there is that representation from a broad range of stakeholders, and in particular, representation from vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So moving on to the actual application template. Here you have the high-level view. The template is made up of 7 different sections, with each section building off the earlier ones. So let's go through each one just briefly. Section 1. The application starts with a description of the sanitation and hygiene sector, including the social, political, economic realities of the country that provide critical country contextual information. It asks the applicant to describe the key and/or vulnerable populations most impacted by poor access to sanitation and hygiene services, and prompts you to consider relevant factors such as household and institutional coverage rates, wealth quintiles, and other equality data, health data, fragility disease tracers, or information to help identify likely hotspots of poor access. Information on the situation facing women and girls will also feature in this section. Given the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund's focus here, it is key to describe the status of access to safe and equitable sanitation and menstrual health services in your country. Section 2. So having described the broad landscape of the sanitation and hygiene sector, this section focuses on the status of national strategic plans and efforts, roadmaps, as James alluded to before. Applicants are first asked to describe commitments made by the government to regional or global goals, as well as to partnerships such as the Sanitation and Water for All partnership. This section will also describe institutional arrangements present in the sector, including respective roles, responsibilities across public and private sector providers, rural, urban, and peri-urban services, as well as community engagement and responses. Describe how this is all coordinated effectively. A description of sector financing is also requested here, which will also be key to inform the approach to meeting co-financing requirements. Section 3, sector assessments and system needs. This will outline what recent assessments have concluded are the key needs across the WASH systems. To support this section, the template refers to the 5 SWA, the Sanitation and Water for All, building blocks, and ask the applicant to describe the particular challenges identified through these assessments and reviews. This list provides an important basis upon which the prioritization of funding support from the SHF is developed in the next section. Section 4, priority activities selected for SHF support. We'll take a closer look at this on the next slide, but it is here where the priority activities selected for support are described. The selected interventions must be seen to be priority areas given all that has been laid out in the earlier sections. That is, within the broader context of system needs, political commitments, institutional arrangements, and importantly, reflecting how the SHF funding will be strategically targeted to meet the needs of the most vulnerable parts of the population. Section 5. This section describes the implementation arrangements proposed to manage the grant activities and financing. It also presents key implementation risks that are associated with the proposed interventions and describes the mitigation measures the applicant will take to ensure the risks are appropriately managed over the course of the grant. Section 6, monitoring progress and measuring the performance of the SHF investment forms a key part of the grant agreement and complements the objectives presented in the application. So it is here in this section will form the basis of a performance framework that is co-designed with the country, building on national systems to the extent practicable. The performance framework will provide the means to assess achievement of intermediate results and activity implementation. Section 7, the last section, is the application budget, where the applicant details the costs associated with the proposed interventions. This will be submitted in the format of an Excel worksheet. The Secretariat team is working to finalize this template and guidance needed for applicants to complete this. You'll also note here in the table, we've provided some guidance around page length. And this will be an area we will want to learn about from your experiences. So feedback will be important to us. These are not firm rules just yet, but it is important to make sure the applications are crisp and to the point. Next slide, please. Now to look a bit more closely at the central part of the application. Section 4 is where the applicant presents the areas selected for Sanitation and Hygiene Fund investment. By using the standard table you see here, the activities selected for support must be organized under one of the strategic objectives or enablers from the strategy. The Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy, that is. In other words, the applicant will duplicate this table so that there is one filled out for each of the strategic objectives it proposes to focus on for the investment. Importantly, the application does not have to propose activities for each SO area. Rather, the proposed activities must reflect the system needs and programmatic gaps that have been described in the earlier sections of the application. And they need to be clearly presented with sufficient detail so that the expected outcomes, the proposed implementation arrangements, the breakdown of key activities, the monitoring plan, and the associated subtotal from the budget are all provided here. There are, though, some exceptions in terms of, for instance, meeting the co-financing requirement. So it's very important that that piece be looked at carefully as you structure this section on investments. Next slide, please. And so we move on to the submission process. As I had mentioned earlier, the application must be accompanied with 2 signatures from the government. Given the diverse approaches to governance of the sanitation sector, Sanitation and Hygiene Fund asks that the applicant decide on the most appropriate government official from the ministry most concerned with sanitation and hygiene service delivery. However, as a second signatory, it does ask that the Ministry of Finance sign on to the application. And that's particularly important given the co-financing expectations and the kind of co-financing requirements. There is an application checklist provided in the guidelines as an annex and repeated here on the slide. So to make sure all of the pieces of the submission are clear, it will be important to ensure the electronic filing is well labeled and organized. And it's important to see, we have noted that the submission deadline for the application will be communicated in the allocation letter to countries. So back to James now for taking us through the last slides. And absolutely encourage and appreciate questions that have been submitted by chat. We really appreciate that this is a lot of information and look forward to engaging with you further. Thank you. Back to you, James.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, it's great to see these questions coming in. For the remainder of the webinar, please do keep posing questions there, things that aren't clear, things that you'd like to know more about, and we will answer them through the frequently asked questions document so that everyone can benefit from the replies. Now, one of the last points that Sarah mentioned there was around submission dates. And I expect that you were asking yourselves, when will you be receiving the country allocation letter and the application pack? The projected timeline is for those to be shared with countries later this month. Now, as Sarah said, there is a lot of information to take in on these webinars, and rest assured we're reaching the end of what we need to share today. But before we close, I would like to share just 2 final slides that show you what happens next after you submit your application. So, after submitting applications, the next step is the independent review. And this is done by an independent review team, an impartial group of technical experts. Now, their job is to provide funding recommendations to the SHF board for approval ahead of grant signing. Looking at the bar along the top of your screens, once an application is received, first of all, it is screened by the Secretariat for completeness. You remember Sarah talking about a checklist and a number of annexes that are required. Once this is done, the application is passed to the independent review team. In the second step here, this team conducts its review of the application against a set of criteria that are agreed in advance. And the independent review team then have a review meeting. The outcome of this meeting is a recommendation for each application. The independent review team can make 2 recommendations, as you see in the box on the screen. The IRT can recommend for approval. This means the application will advance to the grant negotiation step, and any issues identified by the review team will be addressed by the country and the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund ahead of the final grant approval. Alternatively, the independent review team can recommend for re-review of outstanding issues. In this case, the independent review team has identified more significant issues with the application and requests the country to resolve these in advance of the grant negotiation step. The applicant will be asked to address outstanding issues and submit new information for the independent review team for a re-review. References to a competitive proposal process. The allocation is still there for the country, and it will be supported to strengthen its application and resubmit. Next slide, please. And finally, you see here once again the last few steps following the independent review. In step number 5 on your screens, the grant making step. At this stage, capacity assessments are undertaken for the nominated primary recipient, and there will be negotiation and agreement on co-financing requirements, finalization of budgets, and finalization of performance frameworks. And finally, the last step is grant signing, and from there, implementation begins. I also draw your attention to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund Operations Manual, which explains how the operations will run once grants are signed in and the cycle of implementation and monitoring begins. We look forward to successfully reaching this final step, step 6, with countries on the call today. Could we move to the next slide, please? So we have reached to the end of part 2 of the webinar series. As with part 1, this has been recorded, and the recording will be available for you to listen again, and will be shared with stakeholders who are unable to join live today. For those of you requesting a link to the recording of part 1, this has been posted in the chat box. If you scroll up, you should see that. And you can also request that through your regional unit contact points. Part 3 of this series is scheduled for the 18th of August, 2 weeks from today, at the same time of day. This session is designed to answer the questions that you have been posing. So we will not be introducing any more content, but we will be answering questions on the content from parts 1 and part 2. So as you look through the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy, the 4 key policies that we discussed last week, the operating model, and the application pack that we have looked at today, please do share the questions that you have either now at the end of this webinar in the chat box. We will leave this open for some time, or alternatively, please send questions in through your regional managers. And may I request that you do that before the 14th of August. And this will give us time to compile the frequently asked questions and a full response to your questions that we will deliver in this final webinar. So all that remains is to thank Sarah for co-presenting today, for our interpreters and technical support team for putting on this webinar, and to everybody who has taken the time to join today and to find out more about the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, and specifically the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund application pack. With that, I will formally close the webinar. And as I say, I leave the chat box open for you to post